This is Jordan Butler, host of Head Over Heels. Thanks for listening to the following broadcast on Public House Media.
Happy Halloween, fantasy football players. It's Fantasy Football Wizards coming at you once again on a Tuesday. Robert Gardner, Scott Wisniewski. A lot happened on a Tuesday. Usually Tuesday is a pretty quiet week. You get some injury reports, but it was the trade deadline in the NFL. Again, usually a pedestrian day across the NFL, but not this week. A lot happened, and we're going to break it down. First of all, Robert, how's everything going? How was your weekend?
Weekend was a little rough fantasy-wise. Personally, nice weekend, but not a good fantasy weekend for me. How about you, Scott?
We were talking a little bit off the air. I had a 6-1 week, but I think part of it was because of me not paying attention in the late game. So I was telling you, I was watching Red Zone because my hometown team, the Packers, had a bye week. I was watching Red Zone, and when I left to take my grandson trick-or-treating on Sunday, I was losing in 6 leagues and winning in 1. But I had some players playing in the 3 o'clock games, Russell Wilson and Will Fuller being 2 of them. And then I had some people going Sunday night. Long story short, when I came back from trick-or-treating, I was winning in the 6 leagues I was losing, and I lost in the league I was winning. So the moral of the story is don't pay attention. Just set your lineup and go do something fun and don't agonize, because I was agonizing for 3 hours, and I come back and I had a pretty good week. So hopefully everybody out there had a good week, and we're going to talk about some things happening here. But just so everybody remembers, Public House Media coming at you some programming, and we're just happy. We're blessed to be part of it. And let's start by talking about the never-ending saga of the Ezekiel Elliot suspension. I feel like we've been talking about this since we started doing this show, because it's on again, it's off again, it's on again. Now we're going to have a final. It's on again right now. We're going to have a final decision, hopefully by 6 p.m. tomorrow. It's looking like he's going to stay suspended. And if that's the case, we're going to talk about what you should do for the 6 weeks he's gone. But at some point, I just want this thing, pick a lane. Is he on? Is he off? And let's move forward.
No, absolutely. And I mean, this is agonizing for fantasy owners because, how do you make any waiver wire decisions when they're not going to have a decision until tomorrow or Thursday? That makes setting your lineup tough, and it makes life really tough for those Zeke owners out there.
Well, I'll go one further. The longer this thing plays out, and I know that the Cowboys and Ezekiel Elliot don't know how it affects your fantasy team, but you realize if this suspension starts this week, he misses week 1 of most playoffs if your playoffs start in week 14. So because this thing has gotten pushed back, now you're running the risk of losing a playoff game or being down a man if you don't get a bye in your first round because you're not going to have Ezekiel Elliott when your playoffs start.
Oh, absolutely. The timing of this is, it's not great for the Cowboys season in general, but for fantasy owners, this is just worst case scenario.
Absolutely. So the question becomes, and I know we talked about, there's 3 other running backs in Dallas. We talked about this a few weeks ago. If Ezekiel Elliott is suspended, who is the guy to own? Because if you've looked at the stats and the splits for Ezekiel Elliott since he became the starter, he has handled over 90% of the snaps in games that he has played in. So we haven't seen whether or not it's Darren McFadden or whether it's not it's Alfred Morris or whether it's Smith, who I think a lot of the coaches and some of the players are really high on. We haven't seen one emerge because none of those guys are getting more than 3 touches, 4 touches a game.
Yeah, it's hard to get a feel, and it's hard to really get a sense of anything else because Ezekiel Elliott is the definition of a workhorse in the NFL, and he gets so much of the attention and so many carries. You just don't have a good feel for what those other guys look like in that offense.
Absolutely. And you look at these guys, they've had success in other places, at least Morris in Washington and McFadden when he was with the Raiders. McFadden's a little bit more long in a tooth, a little bit of an older back. But I like this offensive line enough as far as how they run the ball that I think any of those 3 guys we talked about could be effective. Do the Cowboys employ a 3-headed monster, or do they pick a guy and have him carry the ball and play 75% of the snaps? And if so, who's that guy?
It's tough to tell. I don't think they really know what they're going to do because I think they're banking on Zeke being able to play. I know Jason Garrett's got to have a backup plan, but they've held that pretty close to the vest, and I just don't have a good feeling with the way the coaches talk and the other players talk. I kind of think Rod Smith might be the guy, but I just no confidence.
Yeah, I think Rod Smith has the most upside. I think if you're going to go with a veteran, though, I think either guy is going to have some decent success, again, behind that line. So maybe Alfred Morris is the first guy to own. I know everybody talked about McFadden. I see McFadden as a change of pace guy a little bit. Maybe Morris, if Morris has been picked up like he's been in some leagues, Rod Smith might be a nice stash. Again, though, I think by week 15, if Ezekiel Elliott's back from his suspension by then, it's going to be a moot point anyway, but I'm sure you still want to navigate through. There's still 3 more bye weeks. You're going to want to have a guy that can play, and in this case, whoever that starter ends up being. If it were me, I'd go Morris 1, Rod Smith 2, Darren McFadden 3 if you're kind of picking through waiver wire.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. The one thing I don't like about Alfred Morris is he doesn't catch the ball great out of the backfield.
Right.
And so that limits him on third down usage.
Right, and McFadden's a better receiver. Rod Smith is actually a dual threat. I mean, in reality, if this were a different point in the season, if maybe you're starting the season with Ezekiel Elliott out maybe through injury or whatever, Rod Smith is probably the best back out of all of them because he's a guy, especially Garrett and his offense, they don't like to interchange backs. Rod Smith's a guy you can leave out there all 4 downs, to be quite honest.
Absolutely. I think that's where he has the most value, and I think that's why when we talk about upside, he's probably the guy that you want to grab. But yeah, Morris is probably the more consistent runner. McFadden, like you said, change of pace, and I think Rod Smith brings kind of both of those assets to you. It's just it's hard to get a good feel for what the Cowboys are going to do.
I agree with you. So that's not the only running back turmoil. So Jay Ajayi gets traded today for a pick to Philadelphia, and that actually has 2 questions now that arise out of this. Number one, what now do you do in Miami? Damian Williams is probably the heir apparent, but that offensive line is terrible. I sat through that miserable Thursday night game where Ajayi gets 21 yards in his first carry and then proceeds to get 2 more yards the rest of the game. And I don't think it's because he has lost he was great last year. He was fantastic. So how much faith would you have in Damian Williams? Now, I'm going to talk out of both sides of my mouth because here it's week 9. How often do you get a chance to go out there and grab a starter? And he is a starter.
Yeah.
At what cost? I say you go out and you make a pick for him, but don't give up too much. Don't drop somebody who's more valuable until you find out how he's really going to fit in that Miami offense.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. And I think maybe for Zeke owners, this is a good waiver wire pickup right here. You're dropping something maybe low value to get something maybe boom or bust, just to keep in your back pocket for the Zeke situation, because as we've talked about, it's going to be hard to make, you don't want to drop too much value on the waiver wire because you don't know if he's going to be available this week or not, and this could be a good low-risk play for you.
Now, for Philadelphia, there's 2 questions at play. For Wendell Smallwood, it probably makes him irrelevant at this point. But what does this do for LeGarrette Blount? I still think LeGarrette Blount's a short yardage guy who's going to get some goal line touches, but you got to think if you don't make the trade for if you're not going to insert him and make him a bigger part of your offense.
Yeah, I just don't. It wouldn't make sense to make this move if you don't plan on leaning on Ajayi. So I think this is really going to cut into LeGarrette Blount's carries, and for LeGarrette Blount owners, LeGarrette Blount is a volume rusher. The more carries he gets, the more yardage he gets, the more points he scores for you. He's not a game breaker type player who's going to break those long runs. So I still think you're going to see red zone carries, but his usage is going to go way, way down in Philadelphia. Maybe not this week, but definitely 2-3 weeks down the road.
And interesting, and we if this were an NFL show, not a fantasy show, we could talk about why this makes sense for the Eagles, because the NFC is wide open. The Packers lose Aaron Rodgers. They might not even make the playoffs. Atlanta has struggled coming out of the gate. They don't look like the team they were last year. Seattle has shown some huge weaknesses in defense. All of a sudden, here's best record in the NFC, thinking we could win this thing.
No, absolutely. I think, from a football standpoint, this is a no-brainer. Like, great trade. This is what you do to take you from contender to over that hump to championship status. This is the kind of move champions make.
Absolutely. And along those same lines, you have a team like the Buffalo Bills, who I don't know that they really thought they were a playoff team in preseason. And they made some trades, and they traded Sammy Watkins away, and they tried to get some help on defense. Lo and behold, they're short some receivers. They don't have a lot of – Jordan Matthews is healthy. Zay has been a disappointment. Clay is out. And they go, hey, you know what? We're a legit playoff team. In comes Kelvin Benjamin, who probably becomes their best receiver in a week or two.
Oh, absolutely. This is a great move by the Bills, and it's a move made by, Sean McDermott, who was in Carolina as defensive coordinator, so he's familiar with Kelvin Benjamin. He knows what he brings to the table. This is a great move, and it makes Tyrod Taylor owners real happy, I think.
Yeah, because he needed that target, let's be honest. Last but not least, the first trade of the week, Jimmy Garoppolo traded to San Francisco. By the way, the interesting story to that is San Francisco releases Brian Hoyer, and it looks like Hoyer is going to sign with New England to be the backup to Brady because they don't have another quarterback on the roster. So they trade their number one pick, which quite honestly, or the number two pick, which quite honestly could be the 33rd pick overall because the Niners are winless. So
it's essentially a first round pick.
Right. So if you're giving up that much, Garoppolo's got to play right away, right?
I mean, you can't give up that much value. Clearly, they didn't like what they had in C.J. Beathard, and they made the decision to pull the trigger on a Garoppolo trade. I think, as far as fantasy is concerned, I wouldn't pick up Garoppolo because without Joe Staley at tackle, he's going to get annihilated back there. So, but long term, this is an interesting move, and I like what the 49ers front office is doing. This past draft, what they've done with this trade to bring in Garoppolo, John Lynch clearly has a vision, but it's going to take a little while to come to fruition. It's definitely not going to happen this year. And
whether it's this week or next week, we're going to see Garoppolo start, and you're going to see three guys who in training camp were on the New England Patriots roster starting in the NFL because Jacoby Brissett obviously traded to the Colts early in the season. And so here they had three deep, and now it's just Brady and his 40-year-old carcass, and both of his backups are going to be starting in the NFL on a different team.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy to think of how much quarterback talent was on that New England roster. I mean, just wow.
Let's talk about some injuries, and two of them are new, two of them are lingering, and one of them I'm not sure about. Guys who might miss some time. Let's start with Zach Miller. It was a tough week for tight ends this week. Zach Miller with a leg injury that there's some talk, and I don't know what the latest news is, earlier this afternoon about trying to make sure they can save his leg from amputation. I don't know if you saw the injury. It was gruesome. I saw it when it happened. I was watching Red Zone at the time. Obviously, I hope for the best for Zach Miller. I'm not even worried about whether or not he comes back onto the field. I worry about him being able to have usage of his leg, much like Teddy Bridgewater had to deal with. Really tough injury to watch.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, my heart goes out to Zach Miller. I mean, it's scary. A really scary injury, one of those freak injuries. I mean, the knee dislocated so far, it tore an artery. And so that's what they had to have the emergency surgery to repair. And I mean, that's a real scary situation. And, just best wishes that Zach Miller can, get the use of his leg back fully.
Absolutely. Not as gruesome. Also, really not unexpected. Jordan Reed's hurt again, and he's kind of already been ruled out for this week. So we'll talk more about Vernon Davis later in the show, but plan to go forward without Jordan Reed this week. So the new injury. So Fournette had the bye week. He missed week 7. He had week 8 off. Keep an eye on anybody who owns Leonard Fournette. Make sure he's healthy. And then Devontae Freeman gets hurt in his game, Atlanta, on Sunday. Watch the injury reports for him as well. 2 obvious guys who were drafted very high, two top 10 running backs. Fournette, one of the top 3 early on in the season. Watch the injury report. And then some bad news, Robert, on Andrew Luck. More setbacks, more pain. Some people held on to him thinking he'd only miss 2 games, 3 games. Now it's 9. He might not be back till after Thanksgiving. I don't think he plays at all this year.
No, I'm right there with you. I mean, it doesn't even make sense to try to bring him back to play this season at this point. Let him get fully healthy, just shut him down, and get him going again after the winter.
I agree. He's Robert Gardner. I'm Scott Wisniewski. We're not in costume, but it is Halloween. It's the Halloween version of Fantasy Wizards here on Public House Media. Real quick, the buys this week. Chicago's off. The Chargers are off. The Browns, mercifully for their fans, are off. Vikings are off. Steelers and the Patriots. So those are obviously the 2 teams, and maybe the Chargers too, from a fantasy standpoint, that you're going to be missing some of your better players. So you're out there looking for players to pick up. Let's talk a little bit about Miracle or Mirage. A couple guys who have had some good weeks, or maybe some good couple weeks. We'll talk about the validity of them. If they're out, I checked through my waiver wires. I told you I'm in 7 leagues. These guys were available in any 5 to 6 leagues based on who they were. Let's start with Alex Collins. Alex Collins was picked up a few weeks ago, and then inexplicably a few weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, before his big game on Thursday, he got released again. He was available in a bunch of my leagues. Alex Collins seems to be emerging as the best back to own in Baltimore.
Oh, absolutely. I think his upside is huge. Baltimore needs to lean on somebody offensively, and he's been their best production so far. So I think you got to keep riding that hot hand.
The next 2 guys, and I know we had a question about, and I'll let you read the question because it kind of plays into what we were talking about. You had somebody ask you about receivers specifically in a 14-team league.
Yes, one of our listeners asked about, he's looking for a diamond-in-the-rough wide receiver in a 14-man league.
I got 3 of them for you, and 2 of them in different leagues. I pondered picking up last week. I didn't do it, and now I have no chance of getting them. The first one, Paul Richardson with Seattle. Doug Baldwin's had somewhat of a quiet season for him after a big breakout year last year. Tyler Lockett really has just not developed as that number 2 option. This week, Paul Richardson had a monster game for Russell Wilson and the Seattle Seahawks. I think Paul Richardson's a guy to look at. And another guy who I really was high on and wanted to wait until after the bye week to pick him up, Juju Smith-Schuster. No chance of getting him now if you're in the upper part of your leagues. I think these are 2 guys that, if they're available, could be obviously are guys that I think you should make a play for.
Oh, absolutely. Richardson, one of the things I worry about with him is his limited number of targets week to week. He hasn't had a game where he's had more than 7 targets, and that's worrisome production-wise, especially with that Seattle offense. Juju, I picked him up in the 14-man league, Chris, so sorry, he's not there for you, bud.
There you go. Well, let me talk about another guy, though. So those 2 guys might be gone. I think you're finally going to see, as Marcus Mariota gets healthy, so too is Corey Davis, the rookie, that a lot of people were high on at draft day. He's been hurt. He hadn't played. If he's sitting out there, he's a guy that I think in the next week or 2, you're going to start seeing him get some targets, build some synergy with Marcus Mariota. So if Richardson and Smith-Schuster are gone, why not take a flyer on Corey Davis?
I think Corey Davis is a great option, especially in deep leagues where it's a lot thinner at wide receiver there on the waiver wire. One of the things to look at is that first game of the season, I believe he was targeted 10 times.
Right.
So clearly him and Mariota have a good rapport built. So when he gets back into action, I think you've got to play on that relationship.
And I think the other piece of that is Rashard Matthews and some guys, Eric Decker, they didn't step up in his absence. So it's not like they cemented a spot and they're the go-to number 1s I think Corey Davis is the guy to look at. And then 2 tight ends in Miracle and Mirage. Jack Doyle, a guy we had heard about all year, and finally he had his breakout game. And then Vernon Davis, obviously with Jordan Reed being out this week, Vernon Davis would be a good start for this week. Your thoughts on Doyle and Davis?
Listen, I think Vernon Davis this week with Jordan Reed being out, great bye-week play for maybe Gronk if you're filling in for Gronk or Gates or Hunter Henry. That's a great kind of bye-week fill-in there. Jack Doyle, I like his upside because of the amount of targets he gets every week. He's one of the most targeted tight ends, and I mean, it's just that's going to lead to production, and we saw that this past weekend.
Couple of sleepers we already kind of covered. So we talked about McFadden, we talked about Morris, we talked about Rod Smith. Pick one of those guys up. Again, whether it's, I think Smith and Morris are the 2 that you target. McFadden, we know what the ceiling is for McFadden. A decent player, but if you got him available and you have a roster spot and you don't have to give up too much, go ahead and pick up one of those Cowboy guys and let's see if it's Smith or Morris that emerges. And again, Damian Williams, he's a starter. So if you're dropping a guy who just hasn't, maybe you're sick of holding Terrence West on your roster because he hasn't played. Somebody like that, go ahead, drop him, pick up Damian Williams. Are there any other sleepers that you're kind of considering this week?
No one's really jumping out at me. One of the guys that I have kind of had my eye on, though, is Demarcus Robinson in Kansas City. Mm-hmm. I think with a tough play, they've had a couple tough weeks, but I think with Chris Conley gone, they're going to use him more on that outside threat, and you're going to see him kind of get some more deep ball opportunities, and there's some potential upside there, especially in the deeper leagues. Absolutely.
I think that's a really good kind of diamond in the rough and nugget to kind of look at. So we're going to move on and talk about one of my favorite segments, keep them or kick them to the curb. And I'm going to start out with a big name, and I know that he's put up a few decent statistical weeks, but by and large, there have been some struggles getting some consistency out of Cam Newton.
Yeah, I think with this Kelvin Benjamin trade, I think this is a sign for you to move on from Cam Newton. I mean, there are some better quarterback scoring options week to week out there, and he's just not going to bring you the value.
Robert Gardner, Scott Wisniewski, Public House Media's Tuesday edition of Fantasy Wizards, talking about players. Not sure if we should hold on to them or you should try to trade them or release them. We mentioned it a little bit. We'll go back to it. But Garrett Blount, his value going forward now that Jay Ajayi is in Philadelphia.
I still think there's value with LeGarrette Blount because I think he's going to get the goal line red zone carries. But by and large, he's going to see reduced usage, and that's going to affect his scoring week to week. So I think outside of the red zone, he's really not bringing much value, but he's going to be a touchdown vulture.
Sure, absolutely. So I don't know how much, because again, I had the luxury of being able to watch Red Zone and not have to flip around. And I watched Mark Ingram fumble the ball twice and then get into a heated exchange with Sean Payton. And normally, that might not be something I would worry about too much. But then when you see what Kamara has done the last couple of weeks, do you start to worry about the amount of carries that Mark Ingram's going to get and what his role in that Saints offense?
Yeah, I think this next week is going to be very telling for Mark Ingram owners. I think what you see this weekend will be kind of a foreshadowing of what the rest of the season is going to bring for his usage. I mean, those 2 fumbles, that took a lot of faith out of Sean Payton there. And with the way the rookie is performing, it's going to be tough to be Mark Ingram, I think.
The struggling Green Bay Packers have a Monday night game against Detroit. So maybe you wait 1 week before you make this move. But Amir Abdullah has become a very frustrating player for anybody who owns him. He's the Lions running back. Again, he might have a good week against the Packers because everybody does. But beyond that, I don't really see him being even an RB2. He's barely a flex right now in my book.
Oh, absolutely. I kind of bought high, a little higher than I should have with Abdullah in the draft early this year, but I've already cut and run from him. I mean, I just don't think the Lions have a true commitment to running the football, and that's going to affect their running back production.
Sure. I think that's right. Let's stay with that game, that Monday night game. Next two players. So with Brent Hundley in for Aaron Rodgers, obviously everybody's value decreases for the Green Bay Packers. But with maybe the possible exception of Aaron Jones, who had a huge week right before the bye week, I'm starting to think that if you have Ty Montgomery with this offense, with this quarterback, with the changes, I don't think he's worth holding on to.
Not at this point. I think Aaron Jones has separated himself as the starter and the premier back in Green Bay. Now, they might not want to update their depth chart or officially make that announcement, but I think it's clear when you look at the production and the usage in game.
We also talked a few weeks ago about what receivers are going to be impacted, and we thought that Jordy Nelson and Devontae Adams would be impacted. Still guys on my roster. One guy wouldn't, though, Randall Cobb. I think from a slot receiver who's a nice luxury player to have if you're Aaron Rodgers, I don't think has a lot of value in a Brent Hundley offense.
Absolutely not. And I looked at this one stat, and this was telling for me if I'm a Randall Cobb owner. He hasn't had more than 4 catches since Game 2 this season.
Right, and that was with Aaron Rodgers throwing the ball. So
that right there, it's time to move.
So before we wrap it up, because we're getting close to the end of our half hour, I wanted to share a story that may not have fantasy impact, although it does, because I think it proves that if you have Cleveland Browns on your team, run and run far. So the Cleveland Browns made a trade, approved the trade with the Cincinnati Bengals. They were going to receive A.J. McCarron for a 2nd and 3rd round pick. A.J. McCarron, the backup in Cincinnati, former Alabama Crimson Tide quarterback. But the Browns were so happy at 3:55 when the trade got done, is they spent so much time apparently congratulating themselves internally. They did not file the paperwork till 4:01, and they missed the deadline. And even though they appealed, the league said, no, the trade is null and void. In typical Cleveland Brown fashion, now you've got 3 quarterbacks who know you were either going to cut them or bench them. So now good luck trying to motivate them, Hugh Jackson, with your 1-23 record as a head coach in Cleveland. So good luck trying to motivate whoever your quarterback is going to be this week. And poor Cincinnati, who didn't do anything wrong, they filed the paperwork, now has a disgruntled backup quarterback who knew you were trying to deal him to the worst possible situation in football. So the Cleveland Browns can't even file paperwork. We knew they weren't very good at playing football this year. They're not very good at filing paperwork either.
I mean, it's the most Browns thing ever. There's no other way to put it. This is the epitome of what the Cleveland Browns are at this point.
Hey, isn't that something? We've come to the end of another week. First of all, I want to thank you again, Robert. Robert Gardner, helping me out. I couldn't do this without you. And I thought we had another week where we could talk for hours, but unfortunately our time is limited. But your time as a viewer isn't limited. So many great shows, Public House Media. Christian Heimel's Press Box podcast will drop again this week. Hopefully you get a chance to listen to that. I've been enjoying all the programming, Robert.
Oh, absolutely. Tune into Public House Media. You will not be disappointed.
And get in on this. I'm glad that we're kind of getting in on the semi-ground floor. I'm loving it, and hopefully you're enjoying it too. We'll be back next Tuesday. I'll be back Thursday. Kevin Wells will join us, and hopefully we'll have a better Thursday night game than the preview, because last week was just awful. Rough. I don't know that Buffalo and the Jets. I'm not going to promise you anything. I will promise you that it probably won't be a 40-point spread in that game. So it should be a better competed game than the one we sat through last week. And then you and I will get together as we start the home stretch for many teams as they start getting ready for their fantasy football playoffs.
Absolutely.
Robert Gardner, Scott Wisniewski, it's the Fantasy Wizards, Public House Media. Good luck to everybody, and we'll see you again on Thursday.